Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We are going to be talking about navigating the evolving landscape of worker screening. Myself and my co-host Daniel. I will introduce Daniel properly in just a second. We'll just wait for a few more people to join us, and then we can get started. So we have a pretty full house today. So just for some housekeeping before we kick off as well. So we will have a brief Q&A session at the end. If you want to pop any of the questions you have through the question section in the chat, we can get to those towards the end of the call. So yeah, the chat will be open throughout the entire call. So please add any questions you have as we're going through into the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can during the webinar session. If we don't manage to get through all of the questions, which sometimes happens, we will take them offline and come back to the participants with a response. So we just hit time and we are starting to get a few people in. This session is also recorded. After the session, we will send a recording and any links to anything that we discuss during the session, which invariably happens all of the time, as well as a wrap up of everything to everybody who was registered to attend the webinar today as well. All right, so just welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just to kick us off, I'm going to go through and talk about what it is that we're going to be covering today. So we're going to be talking about why worker screening is essential in 2025. And then we're going to cover three broad topics and the questions that were included in the original registration. So compliance essentials for 2025. What I commonly refer to as sensible essentials. We'll explain that in a bit more detail. Sensible essentials for 2025 as well. And then fraud prevention and data security. So how technology is changing worker screening. And then we'll go into our Q&A session. So joining me for the session today, our very special guest is Daniel. Welcome, Daniel.
Thanks, Reianna.
So Daniel is from our worker screening partner, MBSI. So within Zemplo, we integrate with MBSI for the purposes of requesting background checks as part of the worker management process. So we've been working with MBSI for quite a while, actually, as a consumer of MBSI products, as well as a partner of the Zemplo platform for about 2 years now. So thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us. Not only are you a seasoned expert in worker screening, I am also looking forward to the fact that you are a seasoned business owner and business leader. So you do have both the knowledge of worker screening and why it's important, and then how it can impact, obviously, a business, as somebody who's been involved in a lot of businesses in your career.
Yeah, I've been around for the traps for a while. CEO of a bunch of different companies, and now with MBSI, I'm actually a part owner of this one, and so very vested interest in ensuring that we get hiring correct.
Fantastic. So that's what, and yeah, shared with most of our participants today, I'm sure. So without further ado, let's jump into a few questions. We'll start picking Daniel's brain. So the first thing, if I were to think about the most common questions that I personally have had since we've added the background checking feature to Zemplo, the two would be, which checks should I do is number one, and which of these checks do you think I can do myself versus which I need a professional for? And for both of those, to be honest, I usually plead the fifth. I don't really know what somebody should be doing. So can you outline the essential checks that every business should be conducting in 2025, why they should be doing it, and also what are the benefits and pitfalls of working with, say, a third party as opposed to getting the picture of a passport and then figuring it out from there?
Yeah, no, very happy to. And it's a very big topic. I think we got 2 hours for this webinar. Is that right, Reianna? No, it is a big topic. When we look at background screening, what we're really looking at is probably 3 pillars, right? Compliance, which is obvious, candidate quality, and cultural fit. And what we're seeing in 2025 is a real focus now on regulatory pressure, as we call it, just because of the changing landscapes. And then we're also in a really interesting talent market at the moment in terms of continuing low unemployment and so on. And that's changing the dynamic of how people actually do their background checking and the whole hiring process. Now, in terms of the regulatory requirements, it is literally a minefield out there. Every industry, healthcare, aged care, finance, construction, have their own unique requirements that are legislated that you must comply with. And there's a whole raft of them against different industries, as well as the foundation ones, like anybody working with children has to go through a working with children check. You've got NDIS, you've got ASIC, APRA, immigration, safe work, and fair work. And they all drive the minimum requirements. And staying across that legislative requirements is really difficult. As an example, most people aren't aware of the Critical Infrastructure Act. If you send people out on site to anything deemed as critical infrastructure, they must go through a full background check. And so where does that take us? Every industry should have knowledge of the minimum requirements that are required legally. And organizations like MVSI certainly stay abreast of that all the time. It can be difficult, but we're always here to offer advice. You don't have to actually use our services. Give us a call. But at an absolute minimum, you should be considering criminal history checks, adverse media checks. And adverse media checks are not one that a lot of people know about, but it is a mechanism for knowing what information is out there in the public domain. And that is really critical, particularly when you look at the ongoing movement towards negligent hiring. Right? We don't see a lot of negligent hiring here in Australia, but it's coming. And that is where outside organizations can sue an organization for not doing proper background checks. So adverse media, absolutely critical. If you're hiring non-Australian citizens, VIVO is absolutely critical. Employment history. Was the person employed? How long were they employed for? And so on. What was the role, salary? Critical one. And then obviously qualifications and licenses. And qualifications and licenses, again, will vary significantly by industry, but you must check them. And then there's a final one that a lot of organizations haven't heard of, again, which is what's known as sanction screening. It's a very simple check. It's non-invasive, and it looks to see whether an individual has ever been sanctioned by a government. And typically it is around terrorism, money laundering, and a range of other things. And it's particularly critical in financial services, but it's also absolutely vital in terms of the Critical Infrastructure Act. So the ones that you must do, criminal, adverse media, VIVO, employment history, qualifications, licenses, and sanction screening. But really, they're just your bare minimum.
Yeah.
We talk about role-based background checks, and role-based background checks are really critical to ensure that not only the person is the person capable, which you can check through academic qualifications, licensed trades, and so on, but it also allows you to look at the capability of that person to do the role in your organization. And that is, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about background checks, the ability to assess whether a person can do that job in your organization is critical. You're unique, everybody's unique, their culture is unique, what they do. And so we always say, combine those minimum checks with reference checks. And we're not talking about whether John Smith was a great guy and would you ever handle him again, or would you ever hire him again. We're talking about behavioral reference checks, which determine how people actually behave in certain situations in the workplace. And one of the benefits of that is that gives you triangulation. Fraud, and I call it fraud, generally called embellishment of CVs around what people are doing, And it's funny, we have a thing called embellishment creep, where 6 months ago it was slightly embellished and now it's normal and now it's more embellished and so on. Triangulation allows you to combine a behavioral reference check with a referee and ensure that that referee is indeed the referee who managed that person during the job. And by triangulating that with your employment history check, you can be sure that it's not a made-up referee.
Mm.
And the number of made-up referees that we see is literally mind-boggling. And there's a process we go through, but if people are doing background checks and particularly reference checks, you really should be checking to see that this person did in fact manage them and they are genuinely their boss and capable of doing a proper behavioral reference check.
So we've had a lot of the checks that we've been talking about at this point, they probably would fall into the bucket of pre-commencement checks.
Good.
At what point do you think is the best point in the sort of pre-commencement cycle or throughout the worker life cycle in general that you would be conducting different kinds of checks? So
yeah, so it's funny. We always talk about pre-commencement checks, but I recommend, and history has shown that if you've got the time, best practice is actually do those pre-commencement checks at shortlist stage. You'll be down to 2, maybe 3 applicants. Anything that you discover during the course of the background check allows you to actually then discuss them during the final interview. And it gives you an opportunity to discuss with the applicant and the candidate, why is this like this and so on, and satisfy yourself before you commit to that employee. And so I just make that little qualification on what is best practice in terms of pre-commencement. You should be thinking about ongoing checks at least annually. And why? People's situations change. And if you look at a person in a role, they have requirements, might be licensing in the finance industry in particular. If you're in a position of authority, or not just in finance, but if you're in the finance function, we look at risk and a person's credit and so on that can put them at risk. And so you should do ongoing checks to see if there's any significant changes in licensing, in their credit position, particularly in sanctions, if this is the person moving around critical infrastructure, and most importantly, adverse media. There's been a number of cases where Uber, the very famous case, Uber, where they had an employee, that employee left for a short period of time. That person was involved in some criminal activity. They brought them back as a full-time employee without actually doing any background checks on them. And then that person continued to commit crime, and Uber suffered significantly as a result. So you really do want to think about a light touch on at least an annual basis. And it's pretty easy to present that to an employee during the course of their annual reviews and so on.
So it's an interesting one. We talk about compliance, and we have a tendency, I think, to talk about it from the perspective of doing the right thing up front. But the other, and I guess it's the perceived distance of this particular kind of penalty that indicates whether we talk about it or not. But there are penalties associated with not complying with particular background check requirements as well. What are some examples of those that are likely to sort of strike a business that doesn't do the things that they're supposed to do?
This is the big one, cancellation of contracts. If you're particularly with government contracts, but it can be with any business, and MBSI is a classic example of this. Because of the work we do and the industries we do it on, we are audited on a regular basis, and we're audited under APRA for all the work we do with financial services institutions, through APRA for our work with companies in the medical industry. And if we don't pass those audits, then our contracts will be cancelled. In addition, if we were to be reported to a government agency, then not only can we be sanctioned by that government agency, but we can be fined. And if you look at it, with the seriousness of something such as Critical Infrastructure Act, your penalties can be up to 7 figures depending on what the nature of the breach was. On top of that, again, you have this concept of negligent hiring, where as soon as you are sanctioned by a government or there's any publication around lost contract and so on, you can be guaranteed that some external perceived stakeholders will be looking for compensation and so on. And so it's a pit that you can fall into and spiral downwards continuously once that ball starts rolling.
So just to round out the compliance section, so checks that businesses ideally have to do, well, typically have to do. I want to talk about the idea of checking something yourself versus checking something with a professional. Now, just to put some caveats around this, I don't mean sort of you doing all of the legwork of doing a check. Well, actually, sorry, no, I do mean that. That is part of it. But the other part is sometimes there is also the business position of I will get somebody to provide me with evidence of having previously completed a check themselves. So they're essentially providing me with the outcome of the check rather than me conducting the check myself. And then there are the examples of I'm going to get the information and then I'm going to do as much as I can in the public domain to essentially satisfy the requirements of a check for the business. So can we have maybe a bit of a discussion about some of the pitfalls of those?
Yeah, it's really interesting. If you compare doing it yourself to using an organisation such as MVSI or any of the other ones on the market, there are a number of challenges doing it yourself. One of it, when we look at documentation, these days, even if it's the applicant supplying a copy of a criminal history check that was obtained, a month or two ago, the ability for that document to be fraudulent. Same thing with degrees, qualifications, and so on. I had to laugh. We saw one come through, and it looked like an absolute perfect copy of a qualification from a well-known university, and it still had a sample watermark on the bottom of it. Right. So some of that's obvious, but we always talk about the concept of reliable and independent. And these days, whenever you get documentation or information, we recommend that you go out and check with reliable and independent data sources that allow you to verify that that information is true and accurate. Now, if you've got the technology in-house to be able to do that, that's fabulous. But organizations such as MVSI and also Exemplo, we spend all day building APIs out to literally hundreds and hundreds of data sources to be able to verify that instantly. And the challenge in today's market with low unemployment, competition for applicants, speed and applicant experience is absolutely critical. And in most cases, if you're going to do it manually and you're going to do it yourself, then you have to think about how do I balance the extended time it's going to take to do that with the fact that I need to make an offer and get this person on board because they're probably sitting there with 4 other offers right now. And so that's a really big consideration when you think about, am I going to do it myself?
Yeah, fantastic. So we'll move on to our next topic now. Actually, we've crossed into it a couple of times, and that's about the idea of a sensible check versus a compliance check. So, and that's actually just a term that I use. A sensible check is basically something that your business probably should be doing to, reduce financial risk, cultural risk as well, actually legal risk. So basically the sorts of checks that help you, that are beyond kind of the compliance mandated checks. So we discussed that a little bit, so keeping in mind that having sort of, and actually you and I in an earlier discussion talked about the idea of confirmation bias and how background checking can help with that sort of thing, is when you're talking about the sorts of sensible checks that a business should have beyond those that are required from a pure compliance perspective, and we've mentioned a couple of them. Do you want to maybe reiterate what those are and then add any additional ones that you think sort of help to achieve that end of removing or reducing, financial, legal, cultural risk?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, we talk about the regulatory requirements. We talk about the capability of an applicant to do a job, and that's usually around their qualifications and licenses and so on. But desirability is really around their ability to do the job in your organization. And that requires a different set of checks. There's no such thing as one size fits all. All those checks should be designed around the actual role and whether or not the organization can do them. The person can do them within your organization successfully. The way you work, your processes, your culture, and so on. And so when you look at that, behavioral reference checks are the absolute cornerstone of that. Regardless of whether you use them for triangulation against employment history. How a person reacts to a certain situation and has done in the past will give you an indication of how they will react and cope and perform in those situations. And so there's quite a significant difference between a behavioral reference check and just a reference check. Did he do a good job? Was he a good guy? Did she do the job properly? Behavior reference checks really allow you to dig in and find out if that person will be successful in your environment, because you're the only person who can truly know that. And so that is one of the, what I call critical essentials if I'm looking at making sure that this person is going to be successful in my organization. Another really, really big one is psychometric profiles. And there's been a lot of discussion around psychometric profiling over the years. We use them internally here at MBSI, and we have established a pattern over the years of the people who are successful in MBSI and the people who may not be successful. And by overlaying those statistics of all those different psychometric profiles, we have a profile of the person who is typically successful in our organization because of the way we operate, our culture, and so on. And so I always recommend psychometric profiling as an essential tool in making a decision, because they'll give you exceptionally good insights as to whether this person is going to fit into your organization and, more importantly, the team that you're about to put them into, because organizational performance is so dependent on the cohesiveness of a team working together, producing outputs and so on. And I've seen this many times in many organizations. One person can destroy the dynamic of that team and bring productivity and output down. And so very, very important. I always recommend psychometric profiles. And as I say, we use them every single day. Every person that comes into our organization does a psychometric profile and a very broad intelligence test as well. And we have the typical bell curve, and we can see where people fit and who's successful. And it's an essential tool for us. And I can tell you, it works fabulously. So
just curiosity question, actually, Daniel, from a psychometric testing perspective, do you share the results with key stakeholders within your team so that you can sort of make some decisions about how you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We discuss it all the time. We discuss continuous improvement, outcomes, and so on, and we continuously refine that all the time. We've been doing that now for probably the best part of 4 years, maybe a little longer. And I am absolutely married to it as a way of hiring the best people.
Awesome. So moving from tests that have obviously been around for a while that people can take advantage of, I am also interested in checks that are newly introduced in, say, 2025. So, like, say, if we flashback 10 years, there probably wasn't such a thing as a social media activity check, which is obviously a pretty commonplace thing now. What sort of checks change over time, actually, in terms of the profile, like what happens when that sort of check is conducted, as well as what sort of new checks get added to the pool of possible background checks that you should be doing?
Yeah, psychometrics one of those. But as you say, two are very big now: social media background checks and what we call adverse media checks. And these are absolutely should be added to the sensible profile, because the the information that's out there in the public domain now is enormous, right? Social media, commentary about organizations and so on, and the risk to brand profile in particular, which is we live in a cancel culture. That's just the way it is. We've seen a ton of initiatives from the general public trying to cancel an organization because of something that they were perceived to have done poorly. And the performance of the employees in their private lives now has a direct bearing on an organization and can have a critical bearing. So being able to look out into that publicly available data, particularly around social media profiles and adverse media. Adverse media is an algorithm that searches the web and looks for adverse things, and those adverse things are typically criminal activity, drugs, and so on. But the big ones are, we have customers in very specific industries that may have, government agencies where you're looking at people's profile in terms of their political views and whether they're extremists and so on and so forth. And they're very important. So the growth in looking beyond just a person's job function has grown exponentially over the last 2 years. And now, I remember 2 years ago, social media was almost it was a very specific one, a well-known organization that looks after the welfare of animals wanted to do social media to make sure there's no cruelty in a person's disposition out there in their private life. And it's gone from a few select organizations to almost becoming mainstream now just because of the world that we live in. And so it's an interesting societal topic of an organization looking at a person solely for their capabilities to do the job versus looking outside that into the person as a whole and whether that introduces risk to an organization based on the world we live in where everything is public all the time. Commentary, critical commentary in particular, very important.
Yeah, awesome. So actually, that gives us a natural segue into the next question we've got, which is considering the breadth of checks that you potentially have to do for a candidate or somebody in your team and their role. What can we do to ensure that a candidate continues to have a positive experience? So, potentially if we're loading somebody up with a lot of pre-commencement background checks and, the outcomes of those, or the timeframes potentially are not that clear. How do we sort of ensure that somebody continues to have a positive candidate experience in light of, the fact that some checks can take a while potentially as well?
That's right. And that's another reason why you make sure, if you're going to partner with an organization such as MVSI, it's really important to understand the technology that can speed up that process. But it's really interesting. Done well, pre-employment background screening can be absolutely advantageous to the customer experience in it gives you an opportunity to explain to the applicant what your core values are and what you care about. And positioned correctly, and it's not hard, and it is genuine. We do it all the time. We do background checks to ensure that the people we hire are successful and that we can give them a workplace environment that they will enjoy and they will stay for a long time. Longevity, tenure, and so on. And so positioned correctly, the first thing it can do is actually demonstrate to your applicant or candidate that you care and that your core values are completely aligned with them, as opposed to an interrogation of are you a good person or not. And the world is moving away from looking at background checks as an interrogation of an individual and is there anything hiding? Absolutely, it will return those results, but it's now a platform to align with that applicant to say, join us. These are our core values and we care about you and we want to make sure that you're going to be a great fit and that you're going to be happy here and you're going to be successful and professional development, career development and everything else. And so in this time of low unemployment and high competition for candidates, that is an absolute essential method of positioning the whole concept of background checks to ultimately give the candidate a great experience before you even start. Because you're saying, I empathize with you and I want you to have a great career with us. And then it's about speed. And this is where you need to decide whether or not you're going to do it yourself or whether you want to employ a third party. And a lot of that is going to really depend on your technology and your capability to get that information. Like I say, we want to avoid confirmation bias. So we want independent and reliable sources to validate things. And with the advent of just data, the digitization of information globally now, particularly relevant in cross-border employment, again, lower unemployment rates in Australia, we are doing more and more cross-border employment. We need to be able to access that data and we need to be able to access it quickly. And if you look at, we're a classic example. We've got a whole software development team down here that does nothing but build software, build APIs out to government data sources, independent data sources, and so on. And so it depends on your own capabilities to access that data, but speed is absolutely of the essence.
So looking as well at the idea of candidate screening, as I mentioned before, you and I have had a separate conversation about the idea of eliminating confirmation bias during the screening process for a business using background checks. So how does doing a third-party background check essentially influence the reduction of bias in the process?
Bias is that's a thing. We're actually recruiting for a fairly senior person in our organization. I was sitting in the boardroom yesterday interviewing this candidate, and I loved him. He was great. And I looked at myself and said, Daniel, you are demonstrating every aspect of confirmation bias, because what happens to human nature, we naturally like people who are like ourselves. And as soon as that happens, our subconscious begins to push away things that we should be looking at, red flags, and so on. The other thing is the hiring manager, we always have pressure to get this person onboarded, hired, secured, and in the job. By putting it with a third party, you remove that bias and you also remove the shortcuts and so on. Now, third parties like MVSI still have pressure to complete those checks as quickly as they can. They're also third parties like us. We have professionals who understand the emotional nature of an applicant and that a background check stands between them and their dream job. So it's almost like an MVSI background check person is almost like a professional psychologist. But it's all about the speed, but having an independent view so that you're not feeling the pressure, I will lose this applicant and therefore I'll have to go through the whole hiring process again. When you remove that emotional level, you get to do substantive checks without bias. Although you still have to, particularly in today's environment, you have to complete them quickly because a typical candidate will have 3 or 4 jobs. And so I don't want to blow our own trumpets, but it is a double whammy or double benefit from working with third-party companies because they have the removal of that bias. At the same time, they have the technology and the experience to accelerate the completion of those background checks. And when you look at AI and things like that are coming into play now, nirvana is same day completion. Now, we're stuck with the likes of the ACIC and others that will have workloads, DVS with the number of data breaches, their turnaround times, and the pressure that's on certain government systems. Nothing anybody can do about that. But generally speaking, a third party should be able to drive that a completion of background checks infinitely faster while removing that bias component.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, just in the interest of time, I want to make sure that I save lots of time for this last topic because I feel like it's a real doozy from other earlier conversations that we've had, which is about the idea of fraud prevention and just general data management in relation to background checks, because I actually also think that's probably an underserved discussion topic when we talk about background checks, the idea that somebody is supplying you quite a lot of their personal information. So, you need to, if we're looking at, again, the idea of a third party versus me doing it myself, if you are doing it yourself, you're taking on all the responsibility for managing that data throughout the life that you have it for. And you need to know what that life is that you're expected to retain things for. But before we get into that part, and you did touch on it briefly, actually, the idea of sort of the fake referee, we'll say, or I'm just getting my friend down the pub to pretend to be my manager for this for this job application. But I mean, that's probably a simple example of a kind of embellishment for a particular kind of check. In this day and age, what sorts of levels of fraud are we seeing for background checks? Because I feel like it's again another thing that we think is a hypothetical. People might be faking their checks, but then I hear certainly from an industry expert perspective that it's a lot more prevalent than any of us think.
Oh, it absolutely is. The number of referees that are falsified, that have never managed this person, that are personal friends and so on, can be as high as 50%.
Wow.
It is absolutely significant. Simple things like when we do employment confirmation checks and we ask for the contact details of the person in payroll or HR, they will give us people who are not even in the HR department. We see that all the time. And it's not necessarily nefarious. It is a person is wants this job. This is their career, their next step. They may be unemployed. We don't know their personal situation. So the motivations can sometimes be not necessarily criminal, but it ranges from simple embellishment, and embellishment is a many-factored thing. We have seen a person who was on the final approach for the chancellor of one of Australia's major universities and had more acronyms and letters after their name than you can poke a stick at. We discovered that half of them were falsified, completely made up. They'd had them for so long that they'd actually forgotten about them, but we were still able to go back and check and verify. Again, reliable and independent is a buzzword. And we found out that half of those were falsified. Probably one of the biggest ones, and we only saw this just recently, we saw a complete fabrication of a 2-year period of someone's employment history. And the sophistication of that was considerable in terms of pay slips, in terms of LinkedIn profile, in terms of connections. And I would guesstimate that it probably took the best part of 2 months to set up that false employment history and profile. It had all of the pieces there. It looked perfect. And then there was one small piece that didn't add up. And again, this is one of the benefits using third parties. So highly trained across anything that doesn't look right, as opposed to, I need to get all these ticks in the box, I need to get this done, and I need to get this candidate hired. One small piece of that puzzle didn't fit. And when we started pulling on that piece of string, the whole 2-year profile of history collapsed. And that was a senior software developer who on paper looked perfect for the company that they were working in, the role that they had, and so on and so forth. And not a single piece of it was real. Mm-hmm. And so fraud has no boundaries. The length that people will do to secure a position for either because they want employment and they're struggling. But then there's also, as I said before, more nefarious reasons where they'll set themselves up in an organization to be able to commit crime, to get into a position of power and authority, embezzlement, and so on. And we saw that in the government, one of the government agencies called Social Security, but whatever they're called now, where that person deliberately joined that organization to be able to get access to data for the purpose of being able to sell it in chunks of 10,000 names at a time. And so people are getting very, very sophisticated for a number of different reasons.
So I'm going to ask a question now about AI, but it's so we can sort of get into with the rise of kind of AI tools that will allow you to make fakes. I want to understand also for MVSI how you deal with that kind of phenomenon that we're just the emergence of which has started happening very recently, as well as what that means for an employer. Say, for example, if I do the classic driver's license check, send me a driver's license. How do I protect myself from the potential of fraud? And also, how does MVSI protect themselves from fraud? And then how would I, as a layperson, do the same if I was going to check some documentation that had been sent to me or manually verify information?
Well, it's funny. Just this morning, a few weeks ago, we identified a fake driver's license. Marked it on the system. Just this morning, that driver's license turned up again in a completely different application for a completely different organization. Same person. So for every document, for every certification, for every license, there is a check or multiple checks to be done. And if I look at driver's license or any government ID in Australia, thankfully we have the DVS. You do need to have a license to access it. We obviously do. And it's the instant verification that that identity is real. And that's very important. And that's passports, driver's license, Medicare, cards, whatever, as well as a raft of other licenses and so on. Again, all the keywords are reliable and independent verification. But at the same time, when you look at the volume of checks that we do, we have profiles of literally every document. If we had a university degree from the Democratic Republic of Congo, we probably have a sample of a genuine one here that we can compare that to. For those doing it yourselves and you're looking at fakes that have been generated by AI, it's becoming more and more challenging, but assuming that they're not perfect. There are many tools on the market, right down to tools like Photoshop and even to a lesser degree, things like PowerPoint, that allow you to zoom right into a document at a very, very granular level and look at things like, are the fonts correct? Are the transitions for the watermarks and other security features correct? You should have a file for what are the security features, in this case of the Australian government issued documents, because they all have them. And if you can't get access to them, you can ask the government agency for a list. And so you can actually look at those watermarks and security features in existence. But when you look at the manipulation, particularly by hand and to a lesser extent by AI, because you can say, hey, AI, I don't like the picture. I don't like my photograph that's in this picture. Can you please insert this photograph? And AI will not bother checking unless you tell it to, that, oh, this is a driver's license, and it's going to put that picture directly in its place. And it's going to do a very, very good job of it. Very good job. And so we have professional tools for looking at that. But if you're doing it yourself, zooming in and out and looking at the transitions, the fonts, blur is very important. Typically, when you take something with the camera, there's a level of blurriness about it. And when you modify that or change the types and so on, that'll be nice and crisp. So take the time. If you are looking at licenses, qualifications, so on, you're going to have to spend 5, 10, 15 minutes looking at those documents to make sure they have not been fraudulently modified.
So on the subject of actually manual verification of documents, not only will you be assuming the responsibility for doing the checks that you just mentioned, which I'm actually going to try after this. I'm going to go and find some fake documents and zoom in on them. What's the responsibility once you have collected that? How do I store this driver's license after? How long do I keep it for? That sort of thing.
We have a pretty substantial client base in Australia, and I would say that 70+% of our clients do not want copies of driver's license, passports, and so on. They want us to store them. Why? Highly secure. We're ISO 27001 certified, which is a very big deal. It's a gold standard for information security. If you are going to use a partner, they need to be ISO 27001 certified. Otherwise, don't. There was another breach this morning in the news. Take them offline. Take identity documents out of your applicant tracking systems, out of your onboarding systems, and out of your HR systems, because pretty much everybody these days uses SaaS, which is out there, even in secure environments such as AWS and Azure and so on. Take them offline. Take them offline and store them securely, which is something that we do. You cannot get access from the web. Our own people can't get access to identity documents. We have a turnaround time of 3 days if somebody actually wants to take them out of the archives, but that's the ultimate protection. And all organizations should treat identity documents with that level of security, as well as other PII, or personally identified information. It's a very, very big deal. We always think about it in terms of not just the legal requirement, but also the moral requirement to our customers, and then to the individuals who trusted us with those documents and keeping them secure. And so information security.
Same with us.
Information security management systems, we have a very substantial one. So should any supplier, if you're going to go to a third party, make sure you understand their InfoSec qualifications, ISO 27001, and how they actually do it. I'm sorry, that's a really big thing for me, because data security is something that keeps me awake at night.
Us too. Well, maybe not awake. There's a few things in there, but yes, lots of things to worry about from an HR solution perspective. Okay, so we are at time. So time for our Q&A. I've got a couple of questions that have come up, actually. So one of the questions that has come through is about contingent workforce management and background checks. So one of the things that sometimes drives getting somebody to supply evidence of having completed a check themselves is, in fact, the incredible speed at which contingent workforce providers will have to bring on candidates. Sometimes it's same day. So if you're in that sort of situation, what would you kind of mandate is like a very low profile way of doing some sort of screening prior to somebody starting work, keeping in mind that obviously the nature of the engagement is different in the sense that it's in most cases temporary, where you have those shorter lead times, so you do have the ability to obviously disengage that person pretty quickly if you needed to.
Okay, so the absolutely foundation ones for contingent, particularly when you're in a rush, identity verification. Identity verification, if they are not an Australian, that'll tell you whether they're an Australian citizen or not, and then straight into Vivo, because you can do those digitally. And then subject to which regulations you are subject to, and that is different by industry. Absolutely go and make the connections to the data sources that validate that that individual has whatever qualifications, licenses, or certificates they are required to have. But the absolute first two should be identity verification, which can be done instantly, and Vivo and the right to work. Now, the nice thing about Vivo is that the Australian government does us a huge favour by doing an extensive background check on somebody before they land in the country, before they issue that visa. particularly to work. And so we can tick some boxes there automatically, and now we're into the licenses that allow them to operate in whatever role it is that we're getting them to function in.
Mm. I have one other question that's come through on the chat, actually. This one, I will allow you to reserve the right to come back with the stats if it's too technical to answer on the spot. In terms of analytics, what is the current error variation used for psychometric profiling?
So okay, I can answer that to a point. And so what we're looking at, fundamentally, there's no such thing. So when you look at psychometric profiling, what we are looking at firstly in the initial collection of that information is we are looking at a person's attempts to skew the answers. And most psychometric tests are designed to ask the same question in different ways at multiple times to look at the consistency of the answers and so on. They had some very good algorithms that will produce scores of the honesty in the approach and the person's desire to portray themselves either honestly or in a bad light. And so each company that supplies psychometric profiling will have their own algorithms. They very rarely share them, but that's step one. And then in step two, when we look at the consistency of success of the profiling, and that is the number of times it's correct, more or less, that our own personal records show that to be very high, and we're talking about north of 80%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it is very high. But as I say, we have 4 years of data that we have exceptionally good pattern matching. But when I look at the cost of a bad hire and the impact, it's absolutely worth the effort. I mean, bad hires have, first problem is an actual, a real dollar term financial hit in the cost of the changeover. The opportunity cost can be ridiculous. If you're looking at a salesperson, they might be carrying $2 million quota, and that person doesn't work out, and it's 6, 8, 9 months before you get rid of them because it's not working. And then you've got to hire again, you've got to retrain. So now you're at 18 months. You're looking at opportunity cost $3-4 million. So it is absolutely worth the effort to spend the time doing or building up your profile of the psychometric overlays, as we call them, to get it more and more accurate over time.
Yeah, actually, now, interestingly, one of the questions that come up in the chat was related to one of the questions that I asked earlier, which is the idea of sharing psychometric testing information. So I actually, in a previous role, that was something that I did because the perception was that it allowed other members of the team to obviously respond to things in your psychometric profile in a way that, it basically meant that people could be more responsive to particular behaviors or that in other individuals in the team might have, which absolutely has value to a business. But that particular scenario, there's obviously a good use case for it. But in other scenarios, are there limitations on result sharing for different kinds of background checks? Is it a way for...
Oh, very much so. So psychometric profiling looks at an individual's predilection against a whole raft of different environmental things, the ability to interact and be comfortable with stress, orders, and so on and so forth. But then your other checks have got to be specifically very targeted towards individual roles. If you're going to have somebody hanging off a high voltage power line, you may want to think very carefully about their attention to detail, their attention span, and when we're talking about specifically psychometric profiling, their attention to detail, their attention spans, and so on and so forth, their attitudes to safety, and a raft of other factors that you may not put somebody else through.
So in terms of, say, if I did a criminal check or a vivo check, etc., what restrictions do I have to put around sharing that data with others? Are there restrictions in terms of there's a there's a requirement for an employer to not share that beyond a point, or not share that at all internally within their team, or?
Oh, very much, very much so. And there's a number of different pieces of law at play, depending on whether we're talking about criminal history check, whether we're talking about Vivo, or anything else. And the biggest one overall is the Australian Privacy Act, and the 12 privacy principles, which fundamentally say that data about an individual can only be used for the precise purpose of which was consent was given, and that data provided. And so you can use that information subject to how you construct your consents, and you can share that data around the team. However, when we look at things like criminal history checks and we look at spent convictions and a raft of other things, there are very specific rules around what can be shared outside the exact hiring manager and decision maker. And typically things like spent convictions can't be shared.
So thank you. One more question, kind of in a similar vein of when we're talking about PII. How do we handle, and the answer would seem to be straightforward. We just, obviously rescind any offer that's been made, etc. How would you advocate or recommend that somebody deals with an objection to having to complete a background check of a particular type?
Mm-hmm. And we see a lot of that as well. And the verifiers are trained to, our verifiers are trained to handle that and understand what is that objection about. Is that objection because just pure indignance? I don't think it's right, and I don't believe I should have to do it. Have I got something that I want to hide in my history that may affect my ability to get the job? Or others, we've had, we live in a gender fluid world, and we had a gentleman who was applying for a role as a sales manager, started life as a gentleman, went to university, changed roles to female, completed the degree as a female, and then decided to go back to being a gentleman again, and didn't want to go through the background check because it would mean exposing the fact that he had achieved his qualifications as a female. And so there's so many different reasons. It is a matter of trying to tease from the applicant what their true objective is. And they are absolutely many and varied. And our recommendation, and we also do this internally, is decide the critical nature of that check. If it's legislation, it's a piece of cake. You can explain to the candidate, look, we're really sorry, but this is required by law. And you're not going to have it just with us. You're going to have it with every organization like us because the law requires us to do this. Again, or we need it for these reasons and so on. And then you have to make a decision whether or not you're going to accept this candidate when they have an absolute refusal to perform that check. And for many, many checks, consent is required, and an individual is perfectly entitled to say no. Now, you can augment those with a lot of background checks. Adverse media requires no consent. That information is in the public domain. To a limited degree, social media checks, that information is in the public domain. We typically ask for profiles, which require consent they have to give us those profiles. But there are other checks that you can do in the background that don't require consent, and that is available. We'll get that from freely available information. But at the end of the day, it is the applicant's right to say no.
Interesting. So you made this very kind offer before. Thank you for that answer as well, Daniel. You made a very kind offer before. So just for my last question, if I am considering hiring a new kind of role for which I haven't had the equivalent in my business previously, or potentially I'm going to a new region, etc., can I contact you to ask about what the requirements of that are likely to be?
Absolutely.
I'll put your phone number in the chat there. No, I haven't got it. Daniel's very good at protecting his PIR.
Yeah, I'll give you my home number. No, absolutely. So we keep abreast of all the legislation. We subscribe to all the different regulators, and we get their regular updates, not just on changes to the regulations, but also outcomes of cases and so on. And then the other thing that we have is across our client base, we have spent many years building up typical check profiles for roles. And these can be senior executives, say in finance, because everybody knows the BEAR regime, and that has its own set of checks that applies typically to executives or responsible managers in the financial services industry, and so on and so on. So we have profiles of appropriate background checks that meet both regulatory requirement and role-based requirements, and we're very happy to share. One thing MBSI is absolutely known for, it's not all about making a buck.
Fabulous. Thank you. That sounds like a fantastic note to finish on, Dan, because we are at time. So thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing all of your expertise with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you for coming along.
My pleasure.
Thank you. After the webinar, we will be sending a recap around to everybody who registered to attend the webinar. Thank you also to all of our attendees today for coming along. Thank you for all of the questions as well. A lot of really valuable insights. So yeah, look out in your inbox for a wrap up of everything that was discussed today and key links that were shared throughout the webinar today. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, again.
Lovely. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.